Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final panel discussion of what has been an absolutely amazing National Hemophilia Foundation State of the Science. I'd like to welcome all of the panelists who consist of the chairs of the working groups. We have one notable absence, and that's Dr. Judith Baker, who sends her regrets from Working Group 5. I would like to welcome all the subject matter experts who have been participating throughout this meeting. In addition to Ms. Vasquez, Esmeralda Vasquez, I would also like to welcome Shelley Horowitz, Ziva Mann, Mark Skinner, Nicole Scapie, and Dawn Ravellini. So welcome to the panel. And lastly, but not least, I would like to welcome our steering committee members and our advisory panel. And of course, a big welcome to our co-chairs, Drs. Len Valentino, Mike Recht, and Kevin Mills, who, after a great presentation, are also joining us today. So welcome, everybody. I would like to actually begin by having all of you take a bow. Thanks to you, we have all gotten to this point, and we have so much to discuss and so much to look forward to. And it's only because of the great work that you all have done. So a big hand to all of you for all your tremendous work to date. Now, as happens with people who do good work, we're asking you to do even more. And that's the work of the panel today. And I think the plan for the panel today has always been to take what we've learned from the extensive work that's been done in each of the working groups and to translate it into a strategic plan for implementation. What are the next steps? Where do we go from here? How do we begin the transformation that Len envisions for NHF as a research organization? And I think that that discussion has actually been the subject of many of the questions that have already come in from the community in the chat. That's exactly what they would like us to do. So we're going to get right to it. As I've explained to the panelists already, we're going to, because of the large size of the group, we're going to go through the group pretty systematically, and then move towards spontaneous comments and see what we can come up with. So without further ado, I'd actually like to ask Dr. Len Valentino to set the stage for this discussion by talking to us for 1 second about the pathway to cures, because Len, not everybody got to hear what you announced in terms of NHF's initiative, in terms of the pathway to cures. And I think that really sets the stage for the next steps that we're going to discuss next. So would you just give us a few words about that, please?
Sure, thanks, Donna. So Pathway to Cures is a new opportunity that NHF envisions for funding particular types of research from particular types of donors that NHF hasn't been able to reach in the past, particularly those that are interested in transformative research. We will have a pool potentially of new philanthropic investors in what's considered traditionally a venture capital type of environment. This really opens up the possibilities for individuals to participate in this program, and also opens up the opportunity for companies that invest in cause-related ventures, such as bleeding disorders. This is a door that has traditionally been closed to NHF in our community in the past, and I think that this really opens that door for us. There are currently individuals that we are working with in the community that are interested in investing in this type of transformative research. So it's really an opportunity to be able to engage people in a type of high engagement, high impact investing that incorporates traditional investing principles, the principles that venture capitalists founded on, also, important business strategies that are articulated by NHF in our mission, but importantly, the decisions that are made are driven by a philanthropic mission with a rigorous focus on measuring and managing impact results according to the mission. So it's really a unique and new opportunity that this community has never been able to access or realize in the past. And as I mentioned in my comments, it's been highly successful in other areas, such as Alzheimer's disease, type 1 diabetes, leukemia and lymphoma, and many, many other advocacy organizations that have similar type of investing for impact funds that are associated with their foundations. And it's really, we're looking for all of you. We're looking for the support, maybe not from you as an individual donor, but obviously if you have the capabilities of becoming a donor for impact, that would be great. But it's more important that you connect us and this program to other individuals who have significant wealth that would be aligned with our mission of finding cures for people with inheritable blood disorders and really enabling people and families to thrive. So this is a community effort. This is not just NHF. The funds that are raised will go into investing into important priorities that our committees will identify, and we'll be looking for participation from the community on those decision-making committees as well. So look for more information that'll be coming soon in the next several weeks as we formally launch this program for the inherited blood disorders community.
Thank you, Len. That was great. So folks, this is real. This is moving on. So let's talk about how we do move on. So what I'd like you all to be thinking about right now is sort of what are the first 2 to 3 steps? If you were advising NHF, what are the first 2 or 3 steps that any strategic plan for implementation of this research blueprint would take? What are the steps that they should take? Like, for instance, you might say things like, get funding for infrastructure while conducting that workforce study, and maybe holding a working group to really hammer out, how data collection should be enhanced to meet, all the, research priorities, the clinical research priorities that have been identified, something like that. Just be thinking about this because I think that all of these thoughts are really important and they're looking to you for direction. So let's start with the working groups, and maybe I'll start with working group 4. Working group 4, Maureen and Angela, what do you think? Do you have any thoughts about what the first steps might be?
I have some great thoughts. Hopefully you can hear me.
Oh, we can. Go ahead.
So I think from my background, and I feel like an interloper here because I'm from the family planning background with contraceptives and hormonal medications. That's not the entire world of NHF, but we have a large body of researchers working on hormonal medications that help with menstruation. They have this known benefit that is not well documented in bleeding disorder patients. And so how do we leverage all of that research capacity to go out and say that these are great medications to not only find patients who could use workup and utilize all the the tools that we have on the bleeding disorder side, but also create better therapeutics. And so I've been in conversations with another task force doing a very similar research priority agenda currently that is funded by FHI 360, Family Health International, and they do global research in contraceptives. They're very interested in hearing our research objectives, and theirs look very similar to ours. So I think reaching across the board, reaching across the aisle to these other groups that are working on similar agendas that have the same questions would be the first place to start.
That's a fantastic idea. Angela, would you like to add to that?
I would. Yeah, I would echo Maureen's sentiments. And I think another issue I think is important is that, at least within our group, a lot of the questions, what has precluded research from being done is like accessing those patient populations. And I think we talked a lot about inclusivity and the transgender population. And I think a lot of advocacy and education needs to be done to help us bring those populations into all this. I don't think that historically we have included those populations as much as we should have. And in order to do this research to benefit those patients, we need to capture those patients to begin with. So I think a lot of advocacy and education up front within primary care, within the general public will be important.
So advocacy and education is an outreach strategy. That sounds great. Okay, working group 5, I'm going to turn to you because about your thoughts about next steps. And Carrie Norris is asking a very specific question about how does this group see health equity being integrated into research infrastructure? And I know working group 5, you've thought a lot about that. So anyway, any thoughts, and then maybe thoughts relating to health equity? Tyler, would you like to go first, or or who's going first? I'm sorry.
Oh, I can get us started.
Go ahead, Vanessa, please.
Great question. And I think the way Carrie poses it also is important because it's about really integrating it. It's about, DE&I not being this separate sort of satellite thing. And one thing that we've been discussing as far as CDC agency-wide under the leadership of Dr. Walensky is she continues to talk about baking in health equity into everything we do. So into research, surveillance, programs, policy, partnerships. And again, it's going to be a step-by-step effort, but it's acknowledging that it needs to be a part of every step of, the research process, the research cycle. We've discussed at length sort of, how do we bring in these other voices and have them at the table and get their lived experience input, but it's also thinking about when we are, writing our manuscripts, when we are developing publications, and if we're highlighting, maybe racial or ethnic differences, well, why are we highlighting those things? Are we drawing attention or potentially, implying biological differences? Or are we recognizing that, for instance, race is a social construct and therefore we have to be cognizant of the social and environmental effects or the environment and other factors that are affecting people's health, in addition to them, being affected by a bleeding disorder. In terms of the journals and reviewing these publications, is there an intent and an emphasis to make sure that these ideas are being communicated clearly, and that it's not another opportunity to sort of dismiss maybe some of these underlying issues that we know are happening that are hard to grapple with, but at the same time we have to acknowledge that we've got these other social and environmental factors. And so we need to think about it from the start of developing research and surveillance studies throughout the entire process to the publication, and how this information gets out to our community. So I'll hand it over to Tyler to see if he has any.
Can I just ask you actually a follow-on question though, Vanessa? Is there a sort of a stepwise program for doing that at the CDC that might inform NHF's process as well?
Yes, I'd be happy. And this program and process is sort of in the midst of the development. I would say it's relatively early, but I would say over the last maybe 4 or 5 months that this has been initiated at CDC. So I was thinking yesterday, in fact, to see if I can sort of get some more concrete materials from those folks at the agency level, so that we can make sure that we are, aligning ourselves. But it's relatively new, and we're being challenged, at the division level, amongst all programs throughout all disease states at CDC to make sure that we have efforts and initiatives that are going to try to bake health equity into everything we do. And there are some programs who already are doing things, and we're being challenged. You can do more. We can do more. Let's continue to try to build on the work that we've done. And if you haven't done anything yet and need guidance, they're trying to have ambassadors to give folks that guidance so that they can at least get started.
And this is a good example of, a lot of our organizations that might be heading in the same direction, really collaborating so that we're actually learning from each other. So that's actually very, very important information. Tyler, did you want to add anything to that from Working Group 5?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Vanessa well summarized while this state of the science was focused on developing prioritized research questions, there's a lot of background work and formative work that needs to be done before we can, get to that point for a lot of these newer, not new topics, but topics that have not been as intensively studied in this community in the past. So I think initially the steps for a group like NHF are related to education and connection. And by connection, I mean helping not just providers and patients connect together, but to help have a conversation among the whole group, so that all these efforts are directed in the right way and remain patient-centric, which I think was a big message from at least Mike's summary, which I saw this morning, part of it. The education efforts are multi-level, so there are lots of things that all of us need to learn about programs designed to impact equity at the individual level. How do we recognize our own biases? How do we act on those and work against them? Susan Lattimore in our group continually made a good point as we were talking that locally and even regionally, we need help identifying what are the problems, what are the barriers that exist that we've created ourselves or that existed outside our centers. What are those barriers to engagement with all of our patients, with all of our families? And then at the regional and national level, there's work that can be done at an education, from an education standpoint as well. And so I think that those are the beginning steps to help us get to the point where, as we build the infrastructure that's been discussed with this summit, as we develop the studies, modify our registries, that we're doing that, as Vanessa says, with these principles really baked into every single effort and every RFA, every research proposal, every study, in a really meaningful way.
That's
But
great.
we've got to understand how to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, actually, diversification and education in most of these principles of our workforce, our IBD workforce across the board, actually was captured as a priority. In that, hopefully that recap can be shared with all of you, and you'll see that the major education effort in that regard was actually captured thanks to the work of your group as a definite priority. So thanks for emphasizing that. And it sounds like it's a good first step. It's, you know, among some of the good first steps. Working group 1, your thoughts?
Hi, I guess that would be me.
Yes, Bobby's not here with us either. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's right. He said that from the very beginning that he was out
Okay.
during that week. So I have made notes as we went along, and I've already heard some of you commenting. So working group 1 was to devise a plan for hemophilia A and B. And turns out that even within working group 1, we had to go to 6 or 7 subgroups to formulate all of our interests, from arthropathy to inhibitors to reading off your diagnostics, gene therapy, transition, disparities, cardiovascular disease. And if the question is how to go from here and how to all pair that up with funding, I think is a major proposition. So how will NHF think about pairing funders with different interest priority groups? And I make it very specific. For instance, let's pick cardiovascular disease, right? Is there a possibility that almost like a cooperative group could form, probably mainly centers who see patients with adult disease, and 5 or 6 centers, and start to study really important questions that came out of this summit, and then how is that going to be funded? So how do you pair that interest, cardiovascular disease, with a funder? Is there a particular grateful patient? Probably not, because they sort of more live in the cancer world, who then give to universities. Is there perhaps a pharmaceutical company who perhaps is more geared towards cardiovascular drugs? I don't know. Hemophilia is such a small sliver of whatever we address. I don't know how broad the interest would be. Is there other funding mechanisms for cardiovascular disease? Just thinking about this one issue. And so going down that train of thought, I think, in my view, having cooperative groups who work together on one particular interest with 3 or 4 interest questions, and pairing this up with funding through NHF and ideas is perhaps one pathway.
That sounds interesting. And so would you advise, as part of that plan, that these cooperative groups should form organically, you know, based on these interests, and as the priorities emerge from this blueprint, and begin working together to formulate some ideas so that they can take advantage of funding if funding does appear, or if funding can be generated? Is that how you might think about proceeding?
Yeah, I think some of this has already been formed, and actually is an outgrowth of this half-year effort to put together important research questions, because these people have already, or that's my feeling, we have already connected or been connected based on our interests. And so over this half year, having formulated together these important questions, it's almost like a buy-in with patients in the group. It wasn't just one person having a research idea. So it was many people, from physicians to social workers, physical therapists, as you all know, was a multidisciplinary, patients, even industry partners, coming up with this plan. So we already have these cooperative groups, if you want, with even sites where trials or data collections or observational studies could begin. The research questions already formulated. Now, what's the infrastructure to look like to come, successfully collect data, and then who will be able to fund it? And so perhaps even the working groups have ideas how that could be funded, and bring it towards NHF and get a little bit of a boost there.
Yeah, great. I think that's a great idea. Okay, how about working group 3?
Could I just
What do you guys think? Yes, absolutely.
I'm sorry. Annette, I think these are great ideas, but I would encourage you also to include some pediatric centers. Cardiovascular disease starts in pediatrics. And to understand this and to really make an impact, we have to start early and we have to look at the effects early. There's been some
Couldn't
early
agree
work
more.
looking
Yes.
at vascular biology in adolescents in hemophilia and how it is affected.
Yes,
Great.
totally agreed. So that could be part of a working group plan. And although we didn't have a pediatrician, for instance, on our cardiovascular disease group, it would then be great to create a cooperative group that intersects with us on cardiovascular disease. Would be fantastic. For instance.
Fantastic. And you know, a lot of you, I'm going to come back to Amy and Diane, and Suchitra, I think, is here as well. Yeah, I'm going to come back to you guys in a second, but I think one of the themes that's emerging is really collaborating beyond, you know, our colleagues in inherited bleeding disorders and collaborating across the lifespan. So these are themes, I think, that are emerging from this. And I just want to draw everybody's attention to a resource that Maureen put in the chat, and also that Ziv has put in some very important information regarding some efforts on including equity in research that are coming out of Department of Public Health in Minnesota. So we're going to maybe amplify that a little bit when we get to the subject matter expert point of view. So that's really great. All right, Amy, Diane, Suchitra, take a stab at what the next, you know, first steps should be on behalf of rare disorders as you've come up with in your discussions.
Well, I'm the head of subgroup 1, so I'll jump in.
Okay,
and
go ahead.
Just want to thank everybody for all of their excellent contributions. I personally have learned so much from this whole journey, just as we did with the inhibitor SOS. So it's been a very, very productive meeting. I would like to refocus everybody back again on the patient with a rare disorder that is wandering around out there without a diagnosis. I think we spend a lot of time focusing on capturing data on the patients that do kind of wander into our office, but they're focused in our group, even though we're the diagnosis and research group, is that so many patients are really, the delay in diagnosis is really unacceptable. Yeah. And as we, as an organization and providers, we shouldn't really be happy with this. I mean, and I know we aren't, but also we can't always just end up focusing on, well, let's get a good biobank going, right? People who are out there without a diagnosis, the biobank is not serving them.
Right.
So I'm not minimizing biobank, but we really need to, especially with health equity, you guys, we're all talking about health equity. There's huge inequity in access to right diagnosis for our underserved populations in California. That includes the undocumented. It includes people with multi-ethnic problems. And the focus in our group, although we were all researchers and it was a fabulous group, is, you know, let's try and help the primary care providers make a diagnosis, because these patients are going to their physician, but the physician just sort of does a DIC screen and says, well, I don't know why you're bleeding. So I think, and I'm going to credit, you know, Rajiv, Dr. Pruthi up at Mayo with the concept of, you know, journey to diagnosis. We heard from Len about journey to cure, but that journey starts with diagnosis, you know?
Yes.
And so I really think that both building in the equity and building in a process whereby the primary care physician, and now, to be honest, even the patient many times will just skip their primary care physician altogether, go to the web and say, I've got a bleeding problem. How great would it be if they could immediately zoom into a diagnostic pathway online? You know, many of you have read the book by Eric Topol, The Patient Will See You Now. Most of my patients are walking in the door. shared this with our other team, you know, that I had a patient come in and they said, my doctor thinks I have ITP. I think I have Henoch-Schönlein-Purpura. The patient was right. You know, so we really need to recognize that patients can get to their diagnosis sometimes faster than their dentist or whoever they're trying to get healthcare from. So I would like to speak and really advocate for equity in a pathway to diagnosis. And I think there are ways that we can do that through social media, through this organization and others, to rapidly get patients to centers that can identify that they have something rare, whether it's our HTCs or academic centers, even that may not be part of the HTC network, but where a good diagnosis can be made, and get them to the proper treatment.
Okay.
Equity, right, guys? That's where equity sits, is that we really need to give people equal access to diagnosis and access to treatment.
Absolutely. Okay. And does anybody in working group 3, Amy and Suchitra, do you want to embellish on that or comment on that? I think that's I mean, having a rare disease is an issue of equity as well, healthcare equity,
Yes.
because most people don't know very much about rare diseases. So it becomes an equity issue in and of itself. Amy and Suchitra, would you like to embellish on Diane's comments or have any further comments there? And then I'm going to
Yes.
go, I'm going to stop and I'm going to interrupt and go to Mike, who has some comments on this as well. Go ahead, Amy.
Well, I want to underscore what Diane said. That is a critical issue for ultra rare disorders. I think there are more issues even layered on top of that. So on top of the lack of community knowledge, the lack of ability to go online and really try to figure out a pathway to diagnosis for providers and for patients, I think that we need to put funding into systems to address these issues. And that includes Athens data systems to address specific disorders, to put education online and to make sure it's visible to the entire medical community across the US, HTCs to increase capacity to see and enter these patients, and very important, centralized testing capacity, both coag and genetics, because many patients who, as Diane pointed out, I have a patient with prothrombin deficiency who's undocumented. How do I get him tested and genetic analysis? How do I get him therapy? It's very difficult, and these are issues that are important. Individuals of color are when you talk about ultra rare disorders being underdiagnosed, individuals of color even fall farther behind because people don't even understand that these are autosomal recessive disorders. Males and females are equally affected, and they affect all races, ethnic backgrounds, etc. So we really have to do a better job at education and making this available and making testing and treatment more available to our entire population. And to do that, we need NHF's help as well, and Athens' help. We need to work together to, develop these resources and have everyone buy in, and we need to work together to approach regulatory agencies to make some of these things easier in terms of getting new pathways for therapeutics streamlined.
That's right. So access to care is really critical in moving forward with any of the research, any of the research agenda in rare diseases.
Yep. It's amplified.
Suchitra, I'm going to give you an opportunity to add to that.
Sure. I would like to echo. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks, Donna. And thanks to NHF for actually making ultra rare diseases a priority. I think, we really have to do something about these patients who are few and far in between and are usually neglected, and that's really has to be prioritized. And to add to Diane's and Amy's comments, absolutely, I think education is key. And I think we really need to probably start off with a networking with general pediatricians, because a lot of these disorders, are diagnosed early on in life, at least trying to make them understand the significance of bleeding. Because,
Right.
we get consults all the time. Oh, I have a patient, I'm referring to you for a nosebleed, but we need to dissect this further in terms of how significant is this nosebleed. If it's like, lasting a couple minutes, that may not be as significant, but if it's a prolonged nosebleed, obviously that patient really needs to get into the hematologist or the HTC office to be worked up further. So I think, efforts along those lines to educate primary care physicians as well as internal medicine physicians would be the starting point. And after that, I think establishing, and this is exactly what we discussed in our subgroup, is establishing something like a utilization management group, like a triage center, where if a hematologist, or I think predominantly this would be for hematologists, has an issue in diagnosing a patient, availing and making sure that there are clinical experts who will guide the hematologist as to what specifically needs to happen in terms of diagnostic testing initially, what do you specifically need, and then going on to offering things like genetic testing. Having geneticists as part of this group in order to interpret the genetic testing results, and eventually, we make the accurate diagnosis, which is so important in order to treat these patients appropriately, because we see all the time patients are mismanaged. They're not, because part of the issue is they're not diagnosed accurately. So I think an emphasis on diagnostics, I think, really will go a long way in serving all our different populations that we've talked about, people of color, diversity, to reach out to undocumented patients, everyone. And in that manner, NHF, Athens, everyone could be helpful in helping to build this kind of website, where I think, it would be very, very helpful. And along the research lines, I think there are several individuals who are interested in individual bleeding disorder research. So having even maybe regional coordinating centers where people could reach out. Oh, I have a patient with factor 7 deficiency. Are you interested in, coordinating genetic testing for this individual through this utilization management group, where there could be links to these different regions, so that either samples can be shipped or patients can go in personally to get, diagnosed.
Okay, so I think what you're bringing up, and I think Diane wants to make another comment before we leave working group 3, but I think what you're bringing up is not only is there an access to care issue, but the infrastructure to appropriately, even within the HTC structures, or the structure in which we deliver care to inherited bleeding disorders, there needs to be some systematizing of the care structure, and really embellishing it so that the right networks are created and the right pathways to diagnosis, even within the referral centers. And so I think you've taken that one step further. Diane, now I'm going to give you a minute to make one last comment before we move on.
Won't even take that. I just want to point out that in our group as well, though, getting that patient with ultra rare, we kind of get them we get them to an HTC. We usually get them to the point of, let's say, factor 7 deficiency, maybe. But factor 7 deficiency is a challenge in that assays themselves that we use are not necessarily sensitive. There's a whole group of factor 7 patients that we're missing. I've talked to Jordan about this. We need to have dollars to improve our diagnostics, as Suchitra just said, but also in the matching process. So here's Jordan, professor now up in Michigan. He's got his grants, and I say to him, I have 50 patients I'd like you to sequence. Well, he can't use his NIH dollars to do that. So we need to identify another, and this is a venture capital opportunity, is we need to identify another pot of money separate from the NIH for these basic scientists. For me, it's platelet glycoproteins. For Jordan, it's factor 7. But we need to have a separate pot of money so that we can take these patients and to the next step, and not just put their samples in the biorepository where they will sit for the next 20 years. Those samples need to go to people who can do further work and diagnose, because from a VC standpoint, knowing that abnormality could open up a whole new set of drugs, getting back to where we started with the hormonal issues. It could be, it could be a different way of turning genes on, you know, upstream genes. Why are these patients that are heterozygotes? They have one normal gene. Why can't we get that gene to turn on? Why do they have disease?
Right.
So
No,
there's a whole wealth of stuff. So we need a separate pot of money for that.
Yeah, and that's hopefully where Pathway to Cures and some of the ideas that Annette was talking about earlier in terms of, you know, taking collaborative groups, you know, begin focusing on what the research priorities are, and then matching potential funding to what's going on in the community. And so I think that actually fits very nicely with the concept that she introduced before that. Before I go, I'm going to go to Working Group 6 next, and Working Group 2, I have not forgotten about you. Mike had a question, and I actually have given the co-chairs the prerogative of speaking whenever they want. So, Mike.
With power comes great responsibility.
Absolutely.
So what I wanted to do was reflect a little bit on the very beginning of this conversation. And one of the most impactful ideas that I took away from Dr. Norris's plenary yesterday, a very impactful plenary, was this idea of in clinical research data missingness being a form of injustice. And this is an issue I think that we struggle with through the HTC network, and ensuring that we are including a representative sample in our research, just based on where resources are, what kind of centers have the resources, who has the people to be able to perform clinical research. So thinking about that, I then was thinking a little bit about one of the most successful programs through Athens, which is something we call our community of practice. And our community of practice is really focused on the data management people at the centers. And it has resulted in an incredible increase in the quality and the completeness of the data that we have within Athens systems now. And that model, that community of practice model, can be directly generalized to research practice communities also. So this idea of setting up a group of people who might be interested in cardiovascular disease or factor 7 deficiency, we have the infrastructure within Athens to set up those type of groups.
Okay, that's really good information. And by the way, I just want to add a couple of comments. There's been a lot of chatter on the issue of turning to public health organizations like CDC, and there's been a comment from Bob Robinson about partnering with schools of public health, akin to Ziva's comment, as a potential collaboration on you know, the issues, some of the issues that we've been talking about, particularly the inclusion of equity in all of our care issues and all of our research issues. So I just wanted to bring those comments to the fore. And okay, I was going to go to Working Group 6. You want to make a comment, Vanessa? If you want to make, I was going to do comments at the end, but do you want to make a comment, a relevant comment? If you make it quickly, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Donna. I just wanted to echo.
Don't apologize. No apologies.
Just to speak to what Mike was saying about the missingness in the data. And yeah. I know it's something we've talked about at CDC, and we struggle with when we have these defined race categories, ethnicity categories that we must follow, but that, people don't feel represented necessarily in some of those categories. And I think about, can't forget one time being at NHF and giving a presentation around, you know, some of the racial ethnic data that we did have, and someone came up to me afterwards and of a Middle Eastern background, and she said, well, you know, what about us? Where are we? And, you know, that stuck with me because, you know, we don't really have a good category. I mean, there might be some, I'm sure there are maybe recommendations of where, you know, people of different nationalities and how to categorize them, but it just sort of speaks to the fact that, you know, people don't feel represented sometimes, and that means we also can't, you know, if there are certain disparities with their health outcomes, we can't see those or tease those out. I think about our data visualization platform and how, because we're dealing with rare disorders in small numbers, and we are concerned about patient privacy. And so we wanted to make sure that the way we presented the data, that people couldn't identify small numbers and couldn't identify people in a way that would be, you know, damaging for the population. But then, you know, people get collapsed to other, which is not, you know, which is not empowering, and also trying to learn more and advocate for your disorder. So these are things that we think about, and we have to think about different ways to approach these issues.
No, it's so true. And I think what you're bringing up, and maybe what I'm hearing, is the point that, you know, equity really needs to almost start at the data capture level, doesn't it? And just in terms of, you know, and as data capture organizations, I mean, we really need to think about how, I mean, even as much as demographic data, how we are capturing that and what that means. And the demographic data may mean, you know, let's think about, you know, environmental health. I mean, demographic data may actually need to encompass, based on what we've been talking about, and especially your working group, a whole lot more information when we talk about, you know, even something as simple as demographics. So I think those are really, really good points. Okay, I'd like to turn to working group 6 for some of your thoughts. And I believe I know we have Jordan here, and I think Maggie's here, and I don't see Guy. Guy, are you here? No, I'd like maybe Steve, who worked on Guy's working group. Maybe Steve, you can speak from that perspective, even before you speak from a steering committee member perspective. So any one of you, Maggie, Jordan, or Steve, can begin to talk about your thoughts. You know, you had a very important mission, and it was infrastructure and workforce development. A lot of this can't happen without infrastructure and workforce development. So there's some very important first steps there. And here, I'll start with Jordan, since you have your mic off, then Maggie, then Steve. But you know, please just have a conversation.
Yes, thank you, Donna. And actually, as an aside, what we were just talking about in terms of partnering with schools of public health, I think that's a great idea. And actually, it's not really an aside, it feeds into some of the workforce issues. And I was just looking at the rankings for the top public health schools. It includes places like the University of Michigan, but also UNC and Emory and University of Washington and UCLA. So a lot of connections to the people in this group and the people that we know well. And actually, you know, I jumped ahead of my primary point, but I'll just continue with this. In terms of training, you know, members of the workforce, I think we can gain a lot. And actually, the School of Public Health here has had a program that a number of our faculty and fellows have enrolled in to teach them how to do clinical trials, right? Many of us are involved in clinical trials without formal training, including our research coordinators, which is what I'm addressing a question in the comments, emphasizing the importance of research coordinators. Many of them, I think, are not formally trained. And I think we thought it would be great to get them involved, and research coordinators and all up and down the HTC, whether it's, you know, anyone who's interested and who's involved with trials, whether it's the social workers or physical therapists, et cetera. But what I jumped ahead of is what we saw as our number one priority is studying the problem, you know, and is there a problem? We all presume that we have caregiver and staff shortages, and I think that's true, but we need to know, is it and what extent is it? You know, how many people are we missing? What are the numbers that we should have, right? How many nurses and physicians should we have per population? As it was mentioned in one of the talks, I think it was Angela who talked about that we have growing and growing clinics, but the number of staff
Aren't increasing. Yeah.
Right, over 10 or 20 years. It's just crazy, right?
Yep.
So what are the numbers? What should we do? What should we have? And what are our goals? What it was maybe, blue sky goals for research staff and bringing people into the research efforts of the HTC. And then, how we fund it, which I think is more Maggie's area. But, one of the things that we thought is to go for, leverage the existing resources that we're not taking advantage of fully, whether it's foundation or philanthropy or pharma and government funding, 340B funds, et cetera. And when it comes to finding funding, sometimes you have to go to NHF, and then you have to go to HTRS, and then you have to go to ASH and NIH.
Right.
Well, wouldn't it be great if we had a centralized website that had somewhere that's for people who want to do either hematology research or bleeding disorders research, however we want to categorize it, where we can go and say, okay, here it all is. And because that was something over my experience, I was always chasing around to different places to find it. And it would be great if we had a web page that was living and constantly updated. And then I think the last thing I'll touch on is the developing some really innovative programs for mentoring. And as I think I said in our discussion in the session, we need to encourage mentoring, and there's been a lot of good funding and programs for that. We should enhance those, expand those, support those, but then also support the mentors, because a lot of mentors are struggling to find time to do this. And I think there's a number of mentors who would spend more time mentoring if they had some funding, and maybe they need some help sometimes for learning how to do it.
I think that's a really good point. And I know that you've talked about the issue of, you've made, and even your group discussed the K-24, as a great mentoring mechanism, and it is. But maybe, Keith can speak to this point. Hello? Is there something? Hello? Can everybody turn off their mics just in case? Anyway, maybe Keith can speak to this because, one of the problems in, most of the NIH institutes is that all K grants compete with each other for funding, and we don't tend to, we don't tend to fund many. And we didn't get that many applications. I don't know if Keith, you can talk to this point of mentoring, or funding the mentor to mentor.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously what you said is true. I mean, the number of applications we get for K-24 is vanishingly small. And it's probably because people are busy doing their other stuff. And it's to write a competitive grant, as you all know, is not easy. So that may be part of it, but also clearly we are prioritizing, at least in heart, lung, and blood, early stage investigators and trainees from K-23s to K-01s to K-08s, all the way up through K-99s to R-00s, which Donna knows a lot about. And those are our priorities. That's where our money is going. And it's not that we would refuse to fund a K-24, but right now we haven't even been challenged because, as I said, the number of applications coming in has been vanishingly small. Also, I think there's a dialogue that needs to happen. This is me talking, not the government, with institutions, because most of you who get NIH funds know that your overhead rates are significant. And part of the reason you get such substantial overhead rates is because mentoring is supposed to be factored into that overhead. So if that overhead is being used for non-training, particularly you don't get as much overhead on training grants, but certainly on other research grants you do, and those junior investigators do need mentoring. So I think that there's a dialogue that's been vanishingly mixed and probably absent in many cases about how important mentoring is from a support of both physical support and intellectual support at a number of institutions. And I'm not saying every institution doesn't use their resources, because I know that even as good as the overhead may be, there are so many challenges to stretch it. So it's not like this is a cut and dried situation, but clearly from where we sit in the government, it is something that has to be shared, because otherwise there will not be enough resources for mentoring. And certainly entities in the private sector and the foundational sector, because you're supporting training or you want to support training, have to keep this in mind. And I absolutely believe that there needs to be more resources for mentoring. No question about it. It's just, how do you prioritize, and from where or from whence do they come?
Yeah, yeah.
And thank you. I just want to say thank you both for pointing that out. I had no idea that it came from the same pot of money. And I agree completely. I would not want to see K-24 cannibalizing, say, a K-08 or a K-23.
Yeah, so I think alternative mechanisms really do need to be developed. Yeah, I think that's that may be sort of a pathway.
And targeted to the busy clinicians who don't have external funding, as opposed to I think I agree that the NIH funded investigators should be mentoring as part of that program. Obviously, all this is targeted more to the busy clinicians who don't have any protected time.
Yeah, and I just want to also say that, we have a lot of workforce to train and educate, and most of that is not in the purview of the NIH. So alternative sources of training funds are definitely going to have to be, one of the priorities. Before I get back to Working Group 6 for a second, let me pivot to a couple of the SMEs, because you haven't sort of been included yet in the discussion. I was going to progress along the way, but this discussion has gone on quite a long time without actually asking your input. So what do you see as the next steps? And then we'll get back to the working group some. So what do you see as the next steps? Ziva, why don't you start, and then we'll go through each of you, if you could give us your thoughts.
Well, I had a whole page of notes, and then Mike said community of practice, which is really what I was trying to go for. We talk, I was not able to listen to all of the summit. The parts I was able to hear, I heard things about people saying, we have to make connections. People identified overlooked resources. People identified folks who could be partners in the work. And this phrase, we're stronger together, kept coming back to me. One of the things that Working Group 6 proposed is essentially not every clinic, right? Not every HCC is going to have everything they need. But if we have a network where people are thinking and working together and can support each other, we can take what we have and make it go farther, because money is not going to fall from the sky, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, a community of practice allows you to identify or lift up resources that have been overlooked, right? It's a way to bring in partnerships. It's a way to curate emerging knowledge as well as existing knowledge and expertise. You can set shared standards, which means we have an opportunity to actually integrate equity into all that's happening and think about how that would work, and actually test out different forms for it in different corners of such a network. You can hold each other accountable and say, these are our standards. What do you need to make it happen? Or
right,
let's figure out what went wrong. You can celebrate the wins. And I have to say, that's almost as important as doing the work, right? Mm-hmm. Because you need something to power you to keep going. So I would say first steps, look, we're all here. Before we scatter to our respective boroughs, let's take a second and let's start building, right? And I think there's one other thing I would add to that, Donna, which is something that Charles Bailey said yesterday, which is that when you're starting on the first steps, keep in mind the 10th step.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So we could go off and say, this piece of research, I can do it, I can own it. Or we could say, that data would be really helpful to fuel somebody else someday. What if I could own it, but I could also contribute it, what I'm learning. So I
Absolutely.
think that would be what I'm thinking.
That's a great point. And he was also meaning it in terms of, when you start, research step one, just think of where you want to get to and ultimately how, what this research is going to look like. So yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful point. Absolutely. Esmeralda, what do you think? What do you think is the next steps? You've been involved with this all the way, including through the steering committee. So go for it.
So I've been taking some notes and just kind of writing some thoughts, and I've been kind of writing some repeated key terms like we keep hearing, like collaboration, equity, advocacy, education, and research. So there's a lot of work here for SMEs. We have a lot to contribute and share, and it's been nice. I said this in another panel, like I don't have an MD or a PhD, but I have a GT, advancement thrombocythemia, and that alone kind of is a very unique experience. But I also kind of was hearing a lot about those hard to reach communities, the people of color. And I envisioned something similar to community healthcare workers, where maybe the NHF can train us SMEs and send us out into the community so we can network with those communities. I mean, I know where they're at, right? So, and it can be very diverse. I know, and I also feel like we connect with each other nicely because we have the same shared experience, and encouraging them. I always, when I meet families in the waiting room, which is where I kind of do most of my connecting, like I always say, like, if they invite you to participate in a research study, I think you should trust the science and be faithful that they are looking after our best interests. And I feel like when it comes from me, it's more sincere and genuine, and they understand we have that same shared lived experience. And I notice this because I do it in my work as a professional therapist. It's hard for me to understand what it's like to live in a wheelchair. But when I connect families together, they open up and they kind of network, and then they start participating in projects, and that's how we get them involved. So that's kind of what I see. I hope my work doesn't end here. Very new to me.
Highly unlikely.
Yeah, it's very new. So I didn't know what I was getting myself into. But I've been writing notes and making keeping like a journal of thoughts. And I feel like we can contribute a lot more than just like our shared experience. I mean, that's definitely like a valuable part, but I think helping reach, especially like me working with like underserved population in the city.
That's an amazing idea, and a community attending to the community, as exactly. Ambassadors, as as educators. I think that is one for the books, NHF. That is a tremendous, tremendous idea. Thank you so much. Okay, Nicole.
How am I going to follow up that amazing answer?
I don't know, but I'm giving you the opportunity.
Start with that. Well, that was also a very lovely response, Esmeralda. And again, I think it's going to be hard to follow up with that, but I've been taking some notes too while this call was happening. And I think for me that I haven't got to participate fully in the State of the Science just due to other work things, but the parts I have got to heard and see, I heard here that there was a category of other that we include as other. And that just sets off like a big red light, big flag for me is, why is it other? Why is whatever they actually are not an option for them to select? So I think that making sure that we are inclusive with all and not just put this other. So I never really thought about it. Like I do a lot of data processing for events and things like that, but I've truly never until today thought about that other category and the significance of who we're missing within that other category. So just a thought. I also think that, as Esmeralda said, I think that we can be the voices for those without a voice and help build the education. I think that I work a lot with the ultra rare community, and I just continuously think about this individual, this family, and this mom who I was at a conference and just in tears, and she's like, he bleeds all the time. We have no diagnosis. We go from place to place and no one will help us. And that kind of goes a little bit more into my group with the whole buck thing, bleeding with undiagnosed cause, right? But I think that we also forget about those folks, and I think it was Dr. Shapiro, I can't remember who said it, but like we need to capture them and we need to start collecting data on them. They are important. And you know, they should be able to go to a center and get help. Maybe you don't have the proper diagnosis, but somebody was talking about how, okay, they have this, but how do I treat them now? How do I code this?
That's right. Yeah.
Just a few thoughts on that.
So,
And,
you'd really endorse the priority of changing how we capture demographics, for sure. Okay.
100%.
Very good point. Very good point. Okay, I'm going to pivot away from the SMEs. I'm going to come back to the rest of you for a second. I'm going to go back to working group 6. And Steve, why don't you start, and then I'd like to go to Maggie, and we're going to mix it up. Okay, go ahead.
Well, Donna, 2 things. First of all, I had to check my own expectations going into this summit. I think personally, I was looking forward to seeing some research priorities that were focused on, you know, transformational and ideally phenotype altering interventions. But what I saw across all the working groups was a breadth of research questions that are aimed at transforming the patient experience, primarily by not leaving anybody behind, overcoming socioeconomic and gender issues. You've heard about pathways to diagnostics. Core focus on meaningful aspects to the patient experience, like focuses on pain, bleeding, joint and bone health. And then some of the research barriers we've talked about, you know, funding, infrastructure, the workforce. So I really applaud the working groups for this, I think the breadth of focus for the research priorities, and ensuring that we aren't just taking a handful of people to the summit to look for a brighter future, but we're actually going to lift the whole population and take them to the summit. And I think that's one of the key takeaways I took from this whole last few days. But with specifically related to the infrastructure and research strategy next steps, I did not hear or see anything over these 4 days that we have to deviate much from the groundwork that was laid at the NHLBI State of the Science regarding thinking about research over the lifespan. The fact that every patient can contribute something to knowledge, that clinical care and research can be integrated together, that from well-phenotyped cohorts, you can conduct really informative observational studies. From those pool of patients, you can have patients moving in and out of interventional studies. Yes. And you can integrate biomarkers, biorepository, informatics across all the omics into those cohorts and those interventional studies. And then the idea of forming partnerships with basic scientists and translational investigators who are cross disciplines outside of even the bleeding disorders. You heard a little bit about that today as well. And all of this, of course, is to drive practice changing application to populations, which is what we all care about. So I think, you know, what Mike Recht and Crystal Watson and the group at Athens has done to pick up sort of the baton from what was laid down at NHLBI State of the Science, you know, the formation of the Athens Transcends concept, the setting up of the biorepository, and getting our HTCs and infrastructure to the point where we can conduct research in the context of our regular routine care for patients. These are all really important steps that we've already taken. And I think as we sort of hone and polish that over the coming months and years, you're going to see those interventional studies as an outgrowth of these observational cohorts. And so I'm pretty excited about the future. I think these research questions are doable, and the barriers that we're going to be overcoming are going to be really impactful for a large portion of our patient population.
That's great. So leveraging our successes already and really continuing some of the thinking that's gone on in the community as well about infrastructure. I think that's really good. And thanks for your endorsement of the program. I really do think that the breadth of research that we have seen come out of the working groups has been amazing, absolutely amazing. So thank you for that. Maggie, how about a comment from you? I don't think you disagree with that at all.
Oh my goodness, that's the center, and it's wonderful. I think Steve said it so well. You know, I was thinking a little more broadly about how we need to organize the HTC Research Network. I agree that all the critical components of the HTC care model really lend themselves to doing research within the network. But I'm sort of thinking about, well, what are those next steps? And one of the things that I thought about was, don't we need to think about, with all these working groups, having maybe an executive committee and steering committees that perhaps propose concepts based on their priorities of research that should be done, and start writing concepts and organize within each of those working groups, protocol committees. And the other thing within that umbrella of organizing the HTC, I really think we need to know what the HTC organization has and what they need. Do we have informatics? Do we have big data? Do we have trialists? What do we need? Do we have epidemiologists? And perhaps within our HTC network, we'll easily be able to say, oh, we have all of these things.
So things, yeah.
But one example would be, do we have folks who are experts on adaptive trial design and how to do small trials? And those are areas where I see that we might either want to garner the support of someone from our working group or put out an RFA, or, I just think we need to almost do a survey. What do we have? What do we need? And so that we can start setting up a working groups. And we might even want to think about rotation so that different people are heads of these different working groups, maybe straight out from the working groups that we have now, and that there's a rotational basis, and that there are young and older researchers on each of these. There are nurse coordinators, there are research coordinators. And all of these exciting things really speak to the need for funding that HTC network, for bolstering the work we need to do. We need resources to fund a data manager, to fund a nurse coordinator, research coordinator, and investigators, and of course, all the wonderful workforce work we need to do that Jordan underscored. The other thing is, in our network, we need to have communication so that, for example, each working group could start working on protocols and be having, conference calls and talking about these things, and across the network, so we know actually what's going on. We would need, large group meetings, and each of these working groups, just almost as we've done, but it works so well. Of course, always think back to the AIDS clinical trials group. It just works beautifully. And each committee, whether it's organized by working group or by the actual subject content, which is how we did it then, had consumers, nurses, investigators, young investigators, epidemiologists, statisticians. It was just so much fun. And we set ourselves this timeline. We had to work quickly. There were so many problems, and I don't see why we can't start organizing the network in the exact same way. That was one of the things that came out of our working group at the NHLBI State of the Science. And I still think we need that HTCG, or whatever we call it. And we need to organize it, and we need to set it up so that it's functional, that it doesn't waste time prioritizing questions and the ways we will try to work on those questions. I'm sure
that's fine. And I think that, that came out loud and clear from your working group and I think what you're emphasizing is that everybody's been talking about collaborative, starting the collaborative research process and beginning to coalesce into research groups. And what you're doing is proposing a structure to do that. So I think that's actually really, really helpful. I'm going to pivot to Shelley. Shelley, are you still here? Yes, are you still here? Oh, there you are. I'm sorry. You keep moving around on my screen. I apologize. And what do you want to add to this? It's a little different than research infrastructure, but please give me your thoughts.
Right. I think I'll be pivoting back to what some of the other SMEs shared earlier. And I'm so thankful that we've all had the opportunity to come together because this is really critical. So many people gave really important input. I love what Diane had to say about the patients that go without diagnosis and the equity there. I think that as SMEs, those are certainly the concerns that end up being highest on our priority level, seeing all these individuals that are just walking around without diagnosis. I want to, you know, Esmeralda talked about the isolation there. I really appreciated, I think it was Jordan who mentioned some inclusivity and some consistency of care. And I think that that's been a concern among some of the SMEs, particularly when you're dealing with women and when you're dealing with individuals with more rare disorders, the sense that if I move from one treatment center to another, I am not guaranteed the same treatment protocols or standard of care. And that's really scary for individuals. So I think that was mentioned, and I think that goes along the lines of what Amy said about really mitigating healthcare bias and dismissal towards individuals and making sure that we're looking at educating medical professionals and kind of taking all that synthesis of what everyone else has said. That then transfers into what Ziva said about really looking at that community of practice and using all of that to bolster all of the research priorities and bring us all together as a community with goals to really start to solve all the issues that were brought up about continuity of care, about mitigating healthcare bias, and all the issues that we're facing as a community. So I'm just thankful that our community together has done such a great job summarizing all the issues and the need to really improve the way we look at research and care for our entire community.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all the great work that's been done. Before I get to you, Mark, I'm gonna go back to working group 2. Veronica, you guys really did a lot of thinking about this, and I know that your work represents the concerns of so many, so many of our constituencies. So what are your, and I don't think Robert's here, right? So I think I'll let you be the spokesperson for what you think are the next steps.
Yeah, unfortunately, like many people, he was having some connection issues. So he would have been here, but his institution has disconnected him. So and I think that might be a theme, that many people are feeling disconnected from this community. So that might be my biggest take-home request, is that we use this as an opportunity to really demand some things from our community. I think the equity issues, I mean, we were all in separate working groups, but a lot of this crosses, the infrastructure obviously crosses working groups. The issues about social determinants of health, equity, and inclusion, I think really need to be mandated as included in, if there are grants being offered for research to be done, this really needs to be included going forward. I think this is a place where NHF can possibly, I don't want to say force people, but, strongly encourage that projects involve the voice of the subject matter experts, that, maybe we need to have the subject matter experts be the persons that are reviewing the proposals and not the scientists. But at a ground level, they can be included. At a ground level, we can include projects that are looking at equity issues, that we're including things that are important to patients. And while I know one of the themes from our group was better understanding of basic biology, I think a lot of the stuff we do is maybe too focused on things that scientists think are important, and looking at quality of life, looking at how people deal with these disorders is equally important. And so there needs to be priority placed on that. Okay. And then the inclusivity, allowing people with these bleeding of unknown cause into our community. And it hopefully won't be bleeding of unknown cause forever. hopefully eventually it will be bleeding due to some specific cause, but we can in some ways separate the need for diagnosis and the need for treatment and the need for a home, and maybe provide some of that to patients that if we are able to do so in a hopefully culturally sensitive way, provide care to a whole bunch of different groups. And that may be one of the best things that comes out of this, in my opinion.
That's great. And, this buzzword of medical home has, been around forever. And I think you're bringing it kind of back into the discussion. Dawn, Mark, before I get to the steering committee and the advisory committee, I have some very special questions for you. So you hang in there. But Dawn and Mark, before I get to them, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what the really next best steps are.
Dawn, do you want to go or go ahead?
No, go ahead, Mark. You unmuted first.
Well, so first of all, I just have to say this has been an awesome and an incredible experience. And what I really have liked, and maybe it's my bias as someone who does live with a bleeding disorder, is that I think we really have sort of set the bar that those of us that live with one of the conditions and our families are not merely the subjects of research, but now we are actually, defined as integral partners, and we are at the core of what we do. I think all of us that live with a bleeding disorder, and certainly those that care for us, are looking for that transformational experience of how we can have freedom from our bleeding disorder. I think I've consistently heard that the focus of research is not just the point of doing research, but really it should be focused on producing outcomes that make a difference to an outcome that's identified as important to patients, that really changes a patient's life in living with the condition. And that really means then that collaboration occurs across the entire ecosystem, from the very early stages of sort of setting up a clinical trial all the way through to the real world. And I think this meeting has been a great example of how patients can participate as subject matter experts and contribute to that knowledge. And so I guess one of the first steps that I was thinking about back sort of to the beginning of this conversation is to avoid the research waste, which we all know occurs because we just sort of miss the target and we don't have the right outcomes. And it's not really addressing what's important to those of us that live with it. Is I think we need some kind of sort of checklist or best practice of what does it mean to be patient inclusive in the research ecosystem. PCORI has done that, and even in grant requests that NIH funds or the AFN funds through Transcends, that we need a way to make sure that there is a checklist or even sort of a litmus test of, is this patient inclusive research, and have you sort of checked some of the fundamental boxes? I think all of this will help us make sure that we advance towards.
That's a good.
Yeah, I think it'll help.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The best practices. Yeah, keep going. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I just have a couple more points.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got this list of Post-it notes here that I've been taking notes on. I think if we build those structures as well before we sort of launch in, I think we will. I think it'll help us get towards health equity. I participated in Work Group 6, the DEI group, and I was a little outside my comfort zone, which was great because I think it forced us all to push forward to do things. I guess the last challenge that I think we still need to carry forward is I don't think that we have fully instilled in the community, meaning those of us that live with the conditions in our families, that we are partners, and that we not only are partners, but we have an obligation to participate in research, and that really every clinical experience should be contributing to knowledge generation. I think many of us are focused on, am I going to get my next product shipment? Am I going to be able to go to my doctor? But I think we need to help bridge that understanding that better science and participation in science is going to allow us to do the better advocacy, because we're going to have evidence-based advocacy, which means then we are going to have better access, and that better access is going to be based on science that makes a difference. So we're going to have better outcomes. So better science leads to better advocacy, which leads to better access, which leads to better outcomes. And I think we need to help communicate to the patient population that there is this arc. And so when you're asked to participate in studies and be involved, that it's as a partner because it's achieving that end. So not only the outcomes in my health, but really why I'm doing this. And I think that that work needs to be done to engage the broader community. We've had a great slice of the community involved, and a nice diverse slice, but we obviously need to go so much deeper. And for those of us that have participated, we've drunk the Kool-Aid, but we need to,
Absolutely.
Kool-Aid stands everywhere.
What you've presented as a virtuous cycle that I think is something that can indeed be incorporated into this blueprint. Absolutely. And Dawn, what would you like to add to that?
So I've been taking notes, and all along the way, I've like, yep, okay, that's what I was going to say. Nope, that's what I was going to say. So I guess that's the risk of going last. But what I keep coming back to, and I know everyone has said this, but is reducing the time from symptoms to diagnosis. And immediately I went, no one said anything about newborn screening. I know in working group 4, we talked a lot about newborn screening and how realistic was this, and would that help with women and girls with bleeding disorders, VWD, rare and ultra rare, the whole gamut. But then I thought, let's take a step back. So I loved also what Diane said about investing for impact in the data collection, and thinking also even further of those who are being seen by hemophilia treatment centers and those that have never been even directed to a hemophilia treatment center, and who's missing. I thought about the awareness campaigns that were brought up and how those should be and could be focused, and that NHF could really drive this. And then I thought about, we keep talking about, patient-reported outcomes. I think they're patient-reported experiences. That's what I'm hearing today, and it's been resonating with me. It's about the experience, not just about collecting the data. And then the thought about data was like, how are we not sharing everything we're already collecting with everybody, so that you don't have to go searching for the data that you're looking for in your specific research project? And then Mike's comment about missing patients is an injustice. All of this led me back to something we have not talked about, and that is the mental health impact on people with blood and bleeding disorders. And I think that we can play a huge role in every one of our working groups. As we are weaving in and baking in health equity, we need to be weaving in and baking in mental health impact. And so that's what I'd like us to do in a nutshell.
Wonderful. That was more than 2 or 3, but that they were all fantastic. So thank you very, very much. Now I'm going to pivot to our steering committee and our advisory committee. And I'm going to especially address our federal partners, because one of the questions that's actually been addressed, and it's been an issue that's come up in the groups, and that is the profile of hematology, the profile of bleeding disorders in the community. So in other words, the question is, everybody knows about cancer and cancer research. How do we raise the profile of hematology and bleeding disorder, in general, and bleeding disorder research? And this actually is a very important question, because in the Pathways to Cure, attracting funders is really going to depend on how much of a profile this research actually ends up having. So I'm going to turn to our august steering committees, and certainly would love comments from our federal partners on how we raise that profile in an effort to sort of raise all boats and think about how we go forward. Keith, do you want to start? You think about research on a daily basis?
Yeah, I do think about this a lot. I mean, I think it's probably I think that an effective approach should involve collaboration outside of just inherited bleeding disorders. Because clearly the disease incidence, even if you add in 1 in 1,000 for von Willebrand disease, is still going to be dwarfed by many of the conditions that we in the federal government have to fund or have to, in the case of HRSA or CDC, surveil or support infrastructure for. So I think, and all of you who are treaters in one way or another have already exploited these kind of connections. But can you come together as a voice in conjunction with your already established partnerships. For instance, obviously, most everyone who's a hematologist in this subdiscipline is a coagulationist by training, and it does thrombosis. So clearly that collaboration has been around since long before I ever went to government. I mean, it's been around for a very long time. I think I think up to now, though, there's been a tendency for people to just switch their hats and say, okay, today I'm speaking as a thrombosis expert. Yes, tomorrow I'm speaking as an inherited bleeding disorder expert. So that's one piece, but that is not the only piece, because every part of non-malignant hematology, and Donna knows because we've had this conversation 1,000 times, is a relatively rare disorder. The only exception is venous thromboembolism, but really everything we do other than that is a rare disorder. So having a louder voice, whether it's speaking on behalf of lobbying, whether it's talking about what research needs to be prioritized, can be more effectively made to the government, I think, if we come together as partners with relevant stakeholders. The other one that Diane certainly knows as well as anyone on this pictorial here is the collaboration with hemoglobinopathies and bleeding and thrombosis disorders. I mean, I think they've been very effective in California bringing these pieces together. We probably ought to apply some of that across 50 states instead of just one. And I'm not saying that none of the other of you have done that. I'm just saying I know they've done it effectively. So I think that's one approach that I would really encourage. There's a lot of, you know, if this showed anything over the three days plus today, it is that there's a lot of time sink that has to go into doing just inherited bleeding disorders. So I don't expect all of you to just suddenly drop everything. So, okay, we're going to build some more bridges here. But I think of these, if you rely on the bridges that have already been built, then when it comes to strategic things, you may have more success because you'll have a higher visibility. I mean, again, in being the small third sibling in a large institute, Donna and I have had, and I continue to have, a lot of experience trying to push stones uphill against cardiovascular disease, which came up earlier in discussion. And maybe that's another place where crossovers could be made. But I'm just saying, on the research side, yeah, you got to concentrate on what you do, which is inherited bleeding disorders. But on the broader side of things, partnerships there, I think, will be very, very helpful. And yes, if you get new resources, they'll be divided somewhat that way. But the worst thing that can happen is if you're competing and you outcompete each other, but you still don't compete well against cardiovascular.
That's right. That's right. So really, that's where the collaboration really means a lot. That's good. That's important. Before I actually go on to some of the others, and I know, Shannon, you have a question. Len wanted to make a comment about Advancement TV, and I wanted to make sure that I gave him the opportunity before he left, unless he's already left.
Oh, I'm here.
So great.
So thanks, Donna. And you asked the question about increasing the profile of the coagulationist and the hemophilia community. So we had the opportunity, NHF and Steve Pipe and I had the opportunity, along with a patient from Illinois, to be interviewed for an episode of Advancement TV. This is a TV show on public broadcasting channels that's hosted by Ted Danson. And it was an opportunity for us to really showcase what the hemophilia community is all about and the important advancements. Their focus was on innovative treatments and gene therapy. But I think it's opportunities like this that we can leverage throughout the community to really increase the profile and let the general population know about coagulation disorders and the specialists that treat these disorders. So I just wanted to make sure that comment was in there, and I'll post a link to the episode in the chat for everyone.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Lynn. And I know you're going to have to leave us to go do the finale here, but thank you very, very much. And I think what we're building here is a multi-prong approach. So what I'm hearing, Shannon, what's your prong?
I have so many prongs. No. So I think we have a really unique opportunity here in the sense that we have all these working groups, and I would recommend that we kind of throw them all in a bag and shuffle them up and get to those task forces that Maggie was referring to. I think that's a fantastic idea. But I think more powerful even is and the reason I raised my hand is because I wanted to build off something Keith had said, is that, we are stronger if we speak with one voice. And if we include all those other voices, including Maureen's, comment about the family planning groups and, all the people who may have other interests that align with ours. And if we say, this is how we're going to do it as a community, and this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to move forward, then we go as one voice to not just the federal funders, but to all the funders and say, if you want to be on this train, this is where the train is going. Right. And we do it as a group. And that is where we'll be the strongest. And a lot of us are pediatric hematologist oncologist, and we've seen the success of COG. I don't know if that funding model, I tried to talk Keith into that one, but I don't know if that funding model is going to be something that we can recapitulate. But I think I do think that there are opportunities here to really take that. We're not really fragmented. I think we have a lot of the pieces, that just all the pieces haven't been put together quite yet, and I think we can do that.
Okay, that's
great. And we don't work, and I think I wanted to also say, I don't want to forget to say, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. We all work within institutions for the most part that have their own agendas. And so we have to go to those institutions too and say, this is how we're doing this. And you may want me to be an independent researcher, but to be an independent researcher, I will work within this group to do that. And, you can't force me, as an institution, as to Keith's earlier point about overhead, we can say this is how these studies are done. And the institutions will have to kind of get on board with that too, because I do think there's a tension there as well.
Absolutely. That's good. Sarah, and then Jill, and then I'd also like to hear from the rest of our federal partners and anybody else who hasn't gotten a chance to speak. So Sarah.
Thank you, Donna. Two points, one specific and one more general. One, I wanted to respond to Dr. Hoot's comments about all bleeding disorders being rare, which is true. But I will also want to point out, in terms of my passion area, women and girls with bleeding, heavy menstrual bleeding is so common. And I think that we have so much to offer those women, even if they don't have a bleeding disorder. When I see patients who don't have a bleeding disorder, by the end of the visit, I hope I've validated their symptoms and taught them that they are right to be concerned. And number two, I can start them on therapy and not send them to Maureen, because that would be a really long plane ride, but to a doctor like Maureen who can pick up from there and continue to help that patient. And then number two, I think what struck me about all of the wonderful sessions this week was that we've really outgrown the term HTC, and that how we staff our HTCs and how the government funds our HTCs really needs to be different. We're not a treatment center for boys and men with hemophilia anymore. We're trying to pay attention to the whole family of hemophilia, including their sisters and their mothers, and sometimes even their grandmothers, because it's been that long before people figure it out. We're taking care of people with connective tissue disorders and bleeding, von Willebrand, bleeding of unknown cause, and this just really, our jobs have grown and the community we're reaching has grown. But as I said before, our staffing and our infrastructure, even within each of our sites, is not.
Yeah, and that message came, especially from the women's group, came across loud and clear. Jill, and then Barb, and then I really need to get back to our federal partners after you guys. So go ahead.
Thank you, Donna. I'll keep it short, other than to say this is such a fantastic discussion. And I echo essentially everything I've heard. The one thing I want to the two pieces I wanted to talk about were related to what NHF might be able to do. And around the funding, we've talked about need for diversity in funding and that the government definitely needs to be part of it because of the federal funding and the intersection with basic research, but that it's important to have diverse funding streams. And if there's a way to bring that together to make the funding more stable, because when you start a project and you're in a rare disorder, especially when there's a longitudinal piece of it, which we really want to see for many of these out of many working groups, that when the natural cycle of that funding ends, the company gets acquired, the funding ends with the opportunity being done with its natural cycle, then we lose the momentum to keep building on those programs.
That's right.
And for other programs to build on them. And I would hope that an organization like NHF would be able to bring diverse streams together in a way where those cliffs are less severe and don't threaten the progress you've made.
Yeah, yeah.
And as part of that, I think NHF can say sharing back to programs is important, which we're hearing in many ways. But one level of that is individual level data, because it's a rare disorder. And if we don't share, we have to give the researchers the credit they did to make that data, but we need to find a way that it eventually comes back and is shared at an individual level. So there's an opportunity to do repeat analysis, to not repeat the mistakes of the past, to be able to generate new hypotheses, and to consider when is it appropriate to share research results back to the participants. Because that's also an important element. And so those were my comments.
Thank you, and very, very important comments. Absolutely. Barb, let me just go to the Peter. I'm going to give Peter a minute to say, to really comment on this. And then I think I don't know, I'm hoping Craig is still with us and that Catherine's still with us as well. And then I definitely am going to get back to Barb too. Go ahead, Peter, wherever you are. You're not here. Okay. Then I'll go to Catherine. Go ahead.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you to everybody for this wonderful experience. I've learned so much and continue to learn, and I think, you know, as the role of the HRSA project director and you know, overseeing the infrastructure funding for the HTC network, I can say that we are very excited with the opportunities that have been laid out and with the opportunities we see in the work that we have been doing. We're on the agency side, we're in terms of diversity and equity, we're happily embedding the executive orders on racial equity and support for underserved communities and preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender into our notice of funding opportunities and into our activities, and using that support to expand our activities on a macro and a micro level within the program where we can, not just in workforce, but in performance measurement. And also, as several others have said throughout the last 4 days, getting that data back to the individual and back to the HTC to ensure that we're using it to support and improve care.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think there'll be a lot of conversation with you apropos the last comment on the whole term of Hemophilia Treatment Center and what that means going forward. But, you know, I know they've got a great partner in HRSA. Barb, we're going to let you finish up the comment here, and then because we're really almost out of time.
Yeah, this has been so incredible and such exciting ideas. And just a couple things, two things I wanted to. One is when we talk, and this has been said before, but when we talk about access and equity and inclusion, that for clinical care as well as research, how important that is. And also how important it is to involve all people who have bleeding disorders, whether we can diagnose them or not, and to acknowledge them. And then kind of different in terms of looking at the longitudinal studies we need that has crossed many working groups. We need to be sure that we have expertise from the outside to get the right data collected in the most cost-effective way and get the right samples. In the past, we have not done that well, and we really need to have the structure to do that well.
And
That's
I
it.
think it's been, yeah, that's the perfect, and it's a perfect ending, because I think we've said many times over that data is the underpinning, you know, for almost all of the work that has to, you know, go on from here. Did I miss anybody? You guys, it has been a whirlwind. It has been tremendous. And I'm just wondering, we've got absolutely a minute left, and I want to thank you profusely, but I wonder if Mike or Kevin has any final comments before actually we let you go on to the main work, which is the rest of this.
We only have
Okay.
a minute left because Len's have
Yes,
to
exactly.
to the next session. But I just want to again thank everybody. You know, when you're deep in the weeds and you're thinking about this all the time, it's hard to, for me at least, to envision what the actual event is going to turn into. And this has just surpassed all my expectations. It's been unbelievably wonderful. So thanks, everybody.